Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Ann Farkas, and I'm a research associate professor at Boston University's Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast today called Recovery 202. I'd like to welcome the universities and the mental health services and the rehabilitation services that are in the audience, and welcome to our audience today. I'd like to go over our agenda and then introduce the first speaker for the afternoon. The agenda for the 60-minute webcast will begin by having Judith Chamberlin, who is the Director of Training for the National Empowerment Center, as well as the Senior Consultant to the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, give her talk for about 20 minutes about the emergence of the concept of recovery and the consumer movement. Then I will speak for 20 minutes about the research base supporting the concept of recovery and the implications of this research for program development. The two of us will then engage in a dialogue between 5 to 10 minutes, talking about the implications of recovery for the power relationship between providers and recipients of services. And we hope there will be at least 10 minutes for questions and answers from the audience at the end of the presentations and discussions. So, without further ado, having given you the agenda, I would like to now pass the proceedings over to Judith Chamberlin, who will talk to you about the emergence of the concepts of recovery. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm going to start by discussing the concept of recovery and some elements of a definition of recovery, because as happens with many concepts in the mental health field, people use this word to mean a lot of different things. But I think the most important point that I would like to make to all of you is that the concept of recovery really developed within the consumer survivor movement and has later been embraced by the larger mental health field, but I think it's very important to always remember that the root of it came from the work that consumer survivors have done. Because in essence, what we've done over the past 25 or 30 years of organizing is to develop a whole different way of looking at the question of mental health, mental illness, and seeing the lives of people labeled mentally ill not as something that we study, but as something that we live, because we are the people who are experiencing what gets defined as mental illness. So as we have developed our practice over the past 25 years or so, we have first begun to define for ourselves what's important in our lives, what we need, what's helpful, what's not helpful. And it's been later on, some of these concepts and ideas have been picked up by the wider mental health field and have been discussed by people within the field, not just consumers and survivors. When we started organizing, and this happened in the United States starting in the early 70s, and also began in a number of other countries at around the same time in Europe, in Japan, and in Australia, and then later on has spread to many, many other countries as well. And there were two major purposes that we formed around. And one was that we saw that it was very important to be a mutual support group for one another, that people who were living with having been labeled mentally ill, who were living in many cases with severe poverty, with some of the things that people call symptoms. We didn't think of them so much as symptoms as just things that went on in our lives. That one of the things we could really do for one another was to give one another mutual support, what's later been called self-help, although I think mutual support is a better term because it speaks to the fact that it's a group enterprise. So that people who got together in organizations formed by former patients saw these organizations as being helpful to them on an individual level because they helped with very practical things. They gave people a place to go, a sense of purpose, friends, companions, and this really helped people to feel that their lives had meaning and direction. So that was the individual level, and co-equal with that individual level was also a more collective or group level. And that was the element of political action or social change, working for rights, working to improve conditions, bringing to public attention some of the abuses that we felt were inherent in the mental health system, things like forced treatment, seclusion and restraints, electroshock and drugs without consent. And these rights issues were as important as the individual work that we were doing. Through all of this, the guiding principle was always that we were concerned with people's lived experiences. We weren't concerned with labels. We weren't concerned with diagnostic terms. We were concerned with the lives that people were living and how we could help people to improve their lives and move forward in their lives. And we didn't see the diagnostic category that a person might be fitted into or the particular labels that they had as defining what people were capable of. And we saw people as full human beings. We saw people as our friends, our companions, and our colleagues, rather than as patients or as clients. So through the development of the consumer survivor movement, it became very clear to us that the major things people needed to live better lives were practical things. People who were living in poverty, who didn't have a place to live, who didn't have adequate food, who were so socially isolated, by definition, were not doing well. And when we help people to achieve those things, when we help people to get adequate food, clothing, and shelter, when we provided people with companionship, when we provided people with a sense of purpose and direction, that had positive impact on what other people might call their mental health, what we just considered to be their general well-being and level of functioning. And because we weren't doing treatment and didn't consider ourselves to be doing treatment, we weren't concerned with symptoms as such, except to the extent that people experienced particular things as disturbing or disruptive to their own lives, in which case we, again, focused on the practical things that people needed so that they could either live with those symptoms or move away from those symptoms. And in many cases, people's symptoms were minimized by what was happening within the self-help and mutual support groups. So this was a very practical kind of learning that we were developing. And it was something that we went into not really having a clear path ahead of us. When we first formed these groups, we knew that there were problems in the mental health system. We knew that there were that we were coming together out of a shared sense of outrage and anger and wanting to bring about change. We didn't really know where it was all heading, but through this lived experience, through the learnings that we achieved through helping one another and through being together, we saw that we really were able to make positive changes in people's lives, and that people really could change and really could grow. And this went against a lot of the conventional wisdom in mental health, certainly at that time, back in the 1970s, that saw serious mental illness, particularly the label of schizophrenia, as meaning that people were going to be incapacitated for their entire lives and that their inevitable course was downward. So our lived experience and the experiential knowledge that we gained through our lived experience was showing us something very different from what the mental health field was telling other people was the truth about our lives. So we were developing a whole different direction and different body of knowledge. For a long time, the mental health field pretty much ignored what was going on in the consumer survivor movement. But starting in, I guess, around the late 70s or the early 1980s, there began to be some opportunities for dialogue and for some discussion and cross-fertilization between professionals on the one hand and consumer survivors on the other hand. This started with the community support program at what was then the National Institute of Mental Health, now the Center for Mental Health Services, who had sponsored a series of conferences called Learning Communities. And those conferences brought together, probably for the first time in an organized way, mental health professionals, people who, with the lived experience of mental illness, we called ourselves consumers or survivors, or ex-patients, and also family members. And it was really the first opportunity for open, honest dialogue and for bridging some very genuine gaps because everybody saw things very much from their own point of view and hadn't really been exposed to the way people from these other groups saw these issues. So it was, although it was very often contentious and difficult, some genuine dialogue and genuine learning went on that slowly, over quite a long period of time, began to influence and change the mental health field and the way things were thought of. And I think that that's where the ideas of recovery began to grow. And we didn't use the term recovery. I'm not even sure when that term became widely used, but the concept of recovery, the idea that people had real lives, that they had abilities to make their own decisions, control their own lives, and that people could succeed in the world of living independently, in the world of work, in the world of social relationships. Those ideas were very much part of our experiential knowledge, even though, as I said, it took a while for it to get the label of recovery. So let me go over some basic principles of the consumer survivor movement. First of all, it's not about treatment. What we do in our groups, in our programs that are run by consumers and survivors is not treatment. It's mutual support and self-help. It's helping people in a way that's based on equality, based on mutual respect, based on respecting the rights and dignity of each person. Within our groups and programs, and that means things like self-help mutual support groups and drop-in centers that are run by consumers and survivors, we have a very broad tolerance for all kinds of behavior, but we very firmly draw the line at violence, which includes verbal violence and physical violence. So we let people know that although we certainly accept them being what other people might call weird or strange or what practitioners might call symptomatic, we will not put one another in danger. And therefore, we let people know that we have expectations of them at the same time that we let them know that we tolerate all kinds of unusual behavior. And this is an environment that really helps people to know that they can achieve control over things that mental health practitioners sometimes say is totally outside their own control. One of the, over the years, I've been to self-help drop-in centers literally all over the world, and they tend to have these list of rules on the wall, usually a piece of post-it paper, and the rules, it's usually written by hand, comes out of group experiences, and wherever I go in the world, the rules are basically pretty much the same rules, which have to do with, as I said, respecting one another, no verbal or physical violence, no stealing, the things that people need to live comfortably together. And those rules are always evolved out of group process. Even though they're the same pretty much from group to group, they weren't copied from one another. They evolved. And they're enforced by the group. So the group says, these are our norms. We have very broad tolerance for all kinds of behavior, but there are certain things we're not going to allow to happen, and when they're violated, people deal with them as a group. And it's very effective. And people, again, who are told in the mental health system that their behavior is outside of their control, learn instead that they can control their behavior and that they have motivation to control their behavior. Over the years, these groups have evolved from unfunded mutual support groups to more established self-help agencies that are funded by state or local government or mental health authorities. So over the years, professionals have had the opportunity to see this whole other way of thinking. They saw users and consumers who were capable and articulate and could put forth a point of view, and who over the years began to run agencies with large budgets successfully. And some professionals saw how this could be a useful part of the services continuum. At the same time, some consumers and survivors began to see that some professionals actually were allies, and there were things that we could work together on in a collaborative way. All this has led up to, just this year, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at the Center for Mental Health Services issuing their consensus statement on recovery. And this is really the culmination of all the work that has happened over these last number of years, to the point where this prestigious body has now embraced a concept that has been developed and refined within the consumer survivor movement, and over the past few years has been labeled recovery. The idea that people can and should be in control of their own lives, that they can grow and develop and change, and that they need opportunities and support in order to make that real. And Charles Curry, who was at that time the administrator of SAMHSA, defined recovery as the common recognized outcome of the services we support. SAMHSA identified 10 elements of recovery, which I'll go over briefly. And these include self-direction, the idea that people with the disability are the ones who should shape the kinds of services that they receive, that services need to be individualized and person-centered, that it's definitely not one-size-fits-all, that it's about empowerment, helping people to have that sense of mastery and control, that it's holistic, deals with the entire person, that it is non-linear, that people progress not in an even way across the various dimensions of recovery, but that comes in fits and starts. There may at times be what seems like going backwards, but overall the trend is upward and positive. That services need to be strengths-based, that is, that they focus on what the person can do rather than what the person cannot do, and that they help people to see themselves as capable and competent people. That peer support is an important element of a recovery-based service. People benefit from being around other people who have been through their lived experiences and can use other people's successes as role models for their own development and growth. That services need to respect people, need to treat people with dignity, need to see people as competent adults, and to treat people basically the way everyone would like to be treated. That services should give people responsibility and recognize that people can make choices, can make decisions about their lives. They may not always make the right choices, but then who of us ever does make always the right choices? And that making the wrong choices and changing from that is part of life. And finally, the last element, which I'm always surprised that SAMHSA put last because I always see it as important to put first, but the element of hope. And hope is the belief that tomorrow can be different from today. And unfortunately, for many years, people with serious mental illness were always put in situations where they were, the services were unvaryingly the same from day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. And that bred a terrible sense of hopelessness. And we have to change instead to make sure that we are always fostering hope in people. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mary Ann. And then I will be back.
Thanks, Judy.
You're welcome.
What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about a little bit about the research base. I'm not going to give you a research talk. I'm going to talk about the basic culture of recovery and mental health services and some examples of recovery program standards that are drawn from the implications of all that Judy said, our experience in some of these research projects. My slides are somewhat integrated into what I'm going to say, and so in order for me to say all this quickly, my suggestion is that you, if you're looking at the screen, focus on the slides as I cue it so that you don't get lost. I'm going to talk about first what the major themes have been that have emerged from the recovery research that's been done. And that research consists of longitudinal studies, first-person accounts, qualitative studies. Recovery is possible and has been documented for over 30 years. This first point is very important because, as some of you may know, there is no section on recovery in the DSM, for example. Not in the manual, not even in the manual's index. There are only a handful of graduate programs which feature a recovery focus, and those of you who are watching now from a university base are fortunate indeed to be part of a program that includes the idea of recovery. Most providers know this word recovery, but many don't believe that it is really possible, except for a select group of individuals whom providers consider to be the cream of the crop. So recovery, this whole idea of regaining a meaningful life and having the possibility of regaining a meaningful life despite having experienced a serious mental illness or a serious psychiatric history is something that exists in the literature, has existed for 30 years, but is not really believed as of yet. Recovery involves more than symptom reduction, and Judy pointed this out in her talk. People often focus on the difficulty of symptom reduction to state their case against the possibility of recovery. They say things like, well, this person can't possibly have recovered. Look at their symptoms are the same as they were. Without understanding that recovery, as I said, is regaining a meaningful life, which may or may not happen with the reduction of symptoms. It involves the resumption of valued roles, well-being, self-esteem, and a sense of purpose and meaningfulness. It's a complex, as Judy said, nonlinear and multidimensional process that can be described, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. And also, it's a highly individualized process with multiple explanatory models used. Again, these are kind of the themes that have come out of the research that I'm going to flash past you in a few seconds. And lastly, recovery is dependent upon a fragmented, distracted, and often unavailable series of services. So let's take the first here. Recovery is possible and involves more than symptom reduction. These are a series of longitudinal studies. The average length of time that was used in these studies, about 22, 23 years. And as you can see, the rate of improvement is somewhere between 2/3 and half of these cohorts in different countries, countries as different as Switzerland, Germany, the United States, all found very similar results, which is that over a long period of time, people in fact reduced their symptoms or had no symptoms. They had little to no use of medication. They were integrated into their local community. They developed friends, and they developed satisfactory family relationships. 1/2 to 2/3. Recovery is a complex, nonlinear, multidimensional process and highly individualized with multi-explanatory models used. That theme came from qualitative studies that were mostly initially conducted by consumer survivor researchers themselves. And what you see here is a compilation of some of those studies which analyzed different narratives and first-person accounts, found different explanatory models, all of which had different major themes, different dimensions, major tasks. But the bottom line was that we discovered that by taking the information from people's perspectives themselves, we could come up with some description of the recovery journey. More studies related to descriptions of recovery with phases and tasks and the kinds of supports that seem to be needed to go through the recovery journey. I'll give you an example of one such description in the Spaniol et al. Study in 2003. There were 5 different particular moments in time in the recovery journey that were identified through these qualitative narratives, and one was being overwhelmed by the disability, struggling with the disability, living with the disability, and then living beyond the disability. And what they found was when they analyzed the content of people's experience, that it could be kind of grouped into those moments in time. Not in the linear way that I just described, because people could go from being overwhelmed by the disability to living beyond the disability and come back again. But these moments in time that I've described seem to capture the essence of people's experience. In other words, at a certain point in time, they felt they were overwhelmed by the disability. They were totally in crisis. Then they were struggling with the disability, struggling to gain a particular valued role in society. Living with the disability meant that people were essentially feeling centered and in charge of one particular valued role, and perhaps are working on a secondary valued role in society at that time. They had found some kind of niche in society. And people who were living beyond the disability were individuals who had gone on to take up their lives and for whom the disability question was far in the past and did not take up very much space at all. So, the point of this is, yes, we know that recovery exists. We know it involves more than symptom reduction. We know that it is possible to describe it, and therefore our hope is that we can conduct more research on it in the future. Unfortunately, it's dependent upon a fragmented, distracted, and often unavailable series of services. What do I mean by that? Well, given the state of mental health services in the United States today, it's amazing that anyone recovers at all. In fact, many people speak of recovering despite the help they get from mental health services. And that speaks to people's resilience. What are services distracted by? Well, in this country, they're distracted by questions of structure, centralized services versus decentralized services, the financial structure of the services, the legal issues, the legislation, all of which are important, but they take up way too much time and energy within the mental health service system. The vision of a recovery-oriented service is pretty foreign. My colleague, Dr. Anthony, says that there was no consumer-based vision prior to recovery. That is, there was no vision for mental health services that was focused on the question of what a consumer might get out of the services. What was important in the system was the location of services. That was greatly debated. In the hospital, in the community, deinstitutionalization, in-day treatment, where was service supposed to be delivered? There was a discussion about what the breadth of service should be. Should it be comprehensive care, continuity of care? And all of those conversations, we feel, distracted people from the issue of what was the outcome of these services. So there's a consensus today that mental health care is in serious need of reform and is not producing effective outcomes. And there are various citations I gave there of reports that have come to the same conclusion. And in the United States, the New Freedom Commission, which was a national inquiry, explicitly stated that recovery should be the overall objective of the mental health system. Well, what would that look like? What do we think would help to integrate and focus the mental health system on outcomes? Well, we believe that recovery should be seen, as Judy mentioned, as the overall mission of a system of care or mental health service. Each system, each type of service should contribute to recovery in its own way. And it should differentiate itself from other services by its outcomes and its impact on various aspects of health. For example, the physical aspects of health, the activity aspects, and the participation. These designations have been developed by the World Health Organization to replace what used to be called impairment, disability, and disadvantage. So the physical aspects of health have to do with thoughts, feelings, and behavior. The activity aspects has to do with role performance. The participation aspects have to do with providing opportunities for integration into society. And what we're saying in this grid is essentially that each type of service within a mental health service system should focus on recovery as its overall mission, should understand which aspect of this categorization it is trying to impact, and should distinguish itself by a stated outcome. For example, treatment is responsible for the outcome of symptom relief and an alleviation of distress, whereas rehabilitation's focus is on role functioning. Okay. The implication of this kind of grid, we think, is the notion that every service can be recovery-focused or not. Recovery is not a kind of service. It is the focus of a service. Consequently, every service can be recovery-focused or not, dependent on how it functions and what kinds of outcomes it's willing to be responsible for. Okay. I'm zipping along here to the next slide. So we believe that developing a recovery-oriented service, whether it's a treatment service in a hospital or a rehabilitation service in the community or a self-help service in the community, means building a culture of recovery that is expressed throughout that service. And it is important, we believe, to make this culture a shared organizational vision. Why? Because when you have a shared organizational vision, it attracts people with shared beliefs and the image of what is possible, and makes the recovery focus of that service a living thing. What constitutes the culture of recovery? We did a series of focus groups to try to see if we could identify some basic values that all constituents within the consumer movement and the people engaged in dialogue about recovery could agree on. We came up with these four. These are not the only four. These are not an exhaustive, this is not an exhaustive list, rather, but these four seem to be the ones that people do not argue about. Person orientation, choice and self-determination, person involvement and partnership, growth potential, and hope. And these were included, by the way, in some measure in the SAMHSA definition that you heard about before. So I'm going to go through each of these and talk about their implications for building a service culture. Starting with person orientation. Person orientation means a focus on the individual as having strengths, talents, interests, as well as limitations. Pat Deegan has talked about the kinds of words that people use when they think they are alone that reveal a non-person orientation. These are words like crazy, nutcase, she says drama queen, the kinds of labels that providers often use when they think they're alone to describe the people that they work with is obviously non-person oriented. Some of the other kinds of questions that you could ask within a service to see whether or not person orientation lives in that service are things like, are the policies, procedures, record-keeping systems all reflective of this person-first language, an individual with certain characteristics rather than a schizophrenic or a manic depressive, which objectifies people and takes away their personhood, okay? Is the physical layout and setting respectful, or is it stereotypic? I like to give this particular example because it seems to resonate with people, but there's a kind of bathroom apartheid that exists in a lot of mental health services, and what I mean by that is that there are, for example, bathroom facilities for staff, and then there are bathroom facilities for users of the service, which obviously sends the message that the users of the service are one kind of person and the providers are another kind of person. So is the physical layout reflective of this person orientation, or is it stereotypic? Patients and providers. Does the program recognize talents and interests or just deficits? Do we spend our time in team meetings just talking about the regression and relapses, or do we also talk about what people are interested in, what their talents are? Is there somewhere on the wall that recognizes things that people can offer and have to share with others, or is it only about deficits? Self-determination and choice. Self-determination and choice is the focus on the right to make individual decisions about all aspects of your own recovery. If you remember some of the themes that we drew from the research, where we said that recovery is an individual journey, which means that my form of recovery looks different from your form. Therefore, I am the greatest expert in my own journey. Consequently, I must have the right to make individual decisions about all aspects of my own recovery, what works for me, what doesn't work for me. Do consumers in the service choose their own goals and their desired outcomes? If recovery is regaining meaningful life, I have to be able to define what a meaningful life looks like for me. Otherwise, it's life but not meaning. That's why my desired outcomes have to be what drives the whole process. Do consumers choose their preferred service to achieve goals? Some people like a lot of structure when they work. Other people like very open-ended, kind of emerging kind of service approaches. Do consumers choose their preferred service during crises? There are some advanced directives in some countries which allow recipients of service to say who they would like to have work with them during a crisis, what kinds of medications they've found useful during a crisis, what kinds of interventions they've found useful, so that that speaks for that individual even when they can't speak for themselves. Can people choose their own medications, as they can in other areas of medicine? Doctors will often give you a choice of medicine, and you have the right in most areas of medicine to choose the level of side effects that you're willing to live with and the cost-benefit ratio. So self-determination and choice is a cornerstone of the recovery process. Person involvement and partnership means a focus on full partnerships in all aspects of the recovery service. That means, as the consumer survivor movement says, nothing about us without us. Do consumers help to design the service, implement the service, evaluate the programs? Do we gather information from consumers to identify what are the variables we should assess to figure out if this is a good service or not? Do we include consumers as providers of service? Are consumers included in designing the service? Do organizations hire professionals and paraprofessionals who are consumers? If there's a board of directors, are there consumers and survivors on that board? Do consumers participate in hiring new staff? When services are organized around delivery models instead of around outcomes, or organized around delivery models instead of organized around individuals, then the service itself becomes a barrier to recovery. The structures that are accountable to organizations that fund service units instead of being accountable to individuals become themselves then a barrier to people's recovery. Services need to be organized around the individuals, being accountable to the individual recipients. Okay. Growth potential. It's a focus on the inherent capacity of any individuals to recover. For example, does the service use client outcome data to change the program design? If you collect evaluation data, is that data used to change how your program operates? If people are not doing well in your service, is the tendency to say, well, it's because people are very sick, or is the tendency to say, that's information for us to say that our program design is not effective? Growth potential says we believe there's an inherent capacity for growth. If we're not tapping it, we have to change the way we do business. Our service is available for those who choose high-level careers, for those who want to go to university, get married, have children. If there aren't services for that level of outcome, then you're basically saying recovery is not possible. Okay. Now, I've been told that we have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to give you one example of a structural standard using these cultural values. So monitoring the program outcomes only reflects measures dictated by state regulations. That's a non-recovery standard related to quality assurance. As compared to monitoring program outcomes include measures that are selected by the clients themselves. That's an example of person involvement and self-determination. I'll just go through these. You have the PowerPoints. You can take a look at them. Staff training focuses exclusively on issues of relapse, noncompliance, dangerousness, and risk assessment, as compared to staff training which includes interaction and interviews with individuals who are living beyond their disability or who have recovered. If staff training doesn't include individuals who are recovered, why would providers believe that it was possible? I just want to leave you with a final thought that an English writer by the name of G.K. Chesterton once said that I love. It is not that the ideal has been tried and found wanting. It is that the ideal has been found difficult and not tried. I leave you with that, and now Judy and I are going to engage in a conversation about some of the implications of this material that I've gone through very rapidly for the kinds of relationships between providers and users within a service system. So, Judy, you want to come back? We're both mic'd, so you should be able to hear us both.
Okay.
Do you want to start off?
I think what we said fit very well together, looking at very much this, from the one hand, knowledge gained from an experiential point of view, and from the other hand, knowledge gained from an academic point of view, and that they're two co-equal kinds of knowledge that can be used to enrich each other.
Right. And I think one of the things that becomes difficult in the emergence of recovery, both as a vision and as a subject of study, is that there is some arguments about, quote, who owns the idea of recovery. Because recovery emerged from the consumer movement itself and from first-person accounts, but now includes a lot of people like myself engaged in this conversation, there is some tussling back and forth about who provides direction for the emergence of this particular vision.
Well, that's why I stressed in the beginning how important it is to always remember the roots of this concept, because if you remember the roots, then you're not going to go too far astray, I hope. If instead it becomes something totally divorced from its roots and becomes just another area of professional knowledge and specialty, then it will become a shell, and it'll become recovery in name only.
Right, right. And I think one of the things that I've seen as I've gone around to various countries that are interested in the concept of recovery that seems to emerge a lot is this notion that recovery can become another club to beat people over the head with. In other words, first of all, if we truly believe that you're never going to get well, then we can use, as providers, we can use the concept of recovery as another way of criticizing and taking away from individuals by saying, well, look, people can recover. We know that 1/2 to 2/3 of the group can recover. What's wrong with you? Because you don't fit my picture of recovery.
Yeah, and I think that point that you made about using evaluation data in a meaningful way, that if people just say, well, you know, people aren't getting better in our service, we must have a really sick group of people, rather than doing the much harder job of saying, maybe we need to change some of the things that we do, and maybe we need to change some of the things that we do in ways that are going to make us uncomfortable. And I think your example of staff bathrooms is a good one, that people who are challenged about that are going to get very defensive, and well, you know, we don't want to, in the bathrooms, people sometimes are having personal conversations, and it's sort of boundary issues, and da-da-da-da-da. But, and forgetting the bigger message that the client sees when they see that sign that says staff bathroom. Well, I'm not welcome there.
Right, right, I'm not a person. And I think the other piece that we wanted to talk about a little bit is just the implications for the nature of the relationship between the provider and the person who is receiving some sort of assistance. Because as I've been a professor in a graduate department for a very long time, and I know that one of the most difficult things is to teach people the skill of listening in a co-equal way. What we typically tend to do is we listen to what people tell us, and if we don't like it, we then try to subtly manipulate the conversation so that it ends up in the arena we think it should be. So people often end up saying things like, well, I'm sure that what you really want is this, even if the person has said something else. And that shift in the power relationship is one of the biggest implications of understanding the meaning of recovery. And I wonder, your thoughts about that.
Well, I think you brought up a point that is really central, and that again, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable to talk about, but unless we talk about it really honestly, we're not going to get anywhere, and that is that whole question of unequal power. And when you have power over people's lives, you shouldn't be surprised that they feel resentful, that they're going to look for ways around you, and that you may appear to be talking to one another and having honest dialogue, but in actuality, you're really often working at cross purposes or just going past each other because people are unwilling to confront this whole question of the reality of power differentials.
Right. I think one of the difficulties in really talking about empowerment and the interpersonal relationships between people receiving services and people offering services is what is the nature of the role that that individual has. If your role includes being able to lock somebody up against their will, or being able to prescribe medication that they themselves have said over and over again is not helpful, then that power differential has to be addressed.
Or even more than that, getting them kicked out of their apartment.
Yes.
So that they lose their place to live because they're, quote unquote, non-compliant with treatment.
Right.
And then seeing that as a treatment decision totally divorced from these questions of power and responsibility and respect and dignity and choice.
Right. Right. I think it's difficult to talk about regaining a meaningful life if we basically start from the premise that people have to be forced to do what is best for them.
Or the amount of second guessing that goes on when, when people make a choice. Well, is that really what you want? And that kind of kindergarten tone that comes into a lot of these conversations.
Right. Right. Okay. How about if, unless there was something else?
Ready to throw it open for?
Let's leave it open for some questions and answers, because I believe we have about, how much time do we have? About 10 or 12 minutes at this point in time. And so,
I hope people have questions.
yes, if you don't have questions, we're just going to keep talking. We'll go back to our slides.
So are we taking questions?
Yes, we're taking questions from the people here, right, Joan? Are we taking questions from the people in the universities that are watching at the moment? No. Not simultaneously. Right, by email. Okay. In order to ask and engage in conversation with us, we're asking that you use the microphone. And that can include you too, Debbie, if you want to be part of this conversation, because we have a small group in the room today.
And do people who are watching know how to access the email? Has that on their screens, or is that? They have to. Okay.
Okay. So questions, comments, discussion. Alan.
Hi, Alan Rosen, visiting from Australia. Judy, you talked about the origin of the recovery movement and the concept. I had an idea it came from drug and alcohol services originally and got adapted from there. Is that true?
I'm not sure. I know that one of the things that we used to talk about in the consumer survivor movement was that in drug and alcohol programs, it seemed to be much more accepted that people who were in recovery or had recovered were given a valued role and were seen as people who had a role to play in service provision long before that became more common in mental health services. So there are some analogies. But I don't think it was adapted directly from that. I do think we saw the idea of practitioners being people with the lived experience as a big part of it.
Joan Rapp from Boston University. I have a question for Judy. In your travels, and I know that you travel worldwide, of the past, let's say, year or so, Do you see any changes that are worth noting in how things are evolving around a more of a recovery orientation, and what kinds of things do you see happening that we should know about?
I think people are very curious about and interested in this concept of recovery, and they want to know what it means, and it's often very hard. And I'm not even sure in English if recovery is the best word, because it so often gets confused with cure or symptom relief, whereas what we're talking about is, to put it in informal terms, getting a life. So when we try to translate it into other languages, we sometimes run into a lot of problems about what's the best word to capture this concept. And that's why I think it's important to have the discussion of the multifaceted definition. And some of us here in the United States are beginning to question whether recovery really is the word that best captures the concept that we're talking about. Because, again, if we go with a very simple, superficial understanding, and for many people who kind of dismiss recovery out of hand because they think recovery means cure, symptom relief. Maybe there are other words that better capture what we're talking about, which is around this whole constellation of people's self-perceived needs and the elements that go into making a good life for anybody, whether they have a mental illness or not, whether they have a disability or not. That it's about having good housing of your choice, that it's about having a valued social role of your choice, that it's about having friends and companions and colleagues, and not just being always in a relationship where you're the user of services and somebody else is the provider. So I think it's very important to develop the idea of the multifaceted definition and then figure out what word or words best capture it in different languages. But people are certainly very interested and want to know more.
Can I add to that, Joan? We did a survey where we contacted about 80 programs around the world and then contacted 41 key informants to cover each of the continents. And what we learned out of this was that it's happening, the idea is emerging not just here in the United States, but as Judy said, to various degrees in every country around the world, or in every region, not in every country, I should say. And I tried to summarize those themes, and they were that in every region there is some notion that recovery is possible. In every region there is some notion, that people other than professionals should be involved in rehabilitation, for example, consumers, family members, neighbors, etc. In many regions, there is an increased understanding that there is a need for community-based services to promote recovery. In many regions, there's a recognition that partnership with users as well as family members is a critical element of service development. In some regions, services delivered by users have become a resource to mental health. In some regions.
I think that's been most pronounced in the United States.
Most in the United States, but also in parts of New Zealand and Canada.
Right. It's still though pretty
It's pretty rare. It's pretty rare, but it does happen. I was trying to show hope.
Right. No, and I think that's one of the most exciting things, because there's a lot of things that we can say are terribly wrong in the mental health system in the U.S. But I think it's one of the things we can really point to is the development of funded, recognized programs that use the modality of self-help and mutual support as either an adjunct to traditional mental health services, or, depending on the person's choice, as their service of choice. And I think that the maturing of this movement will be when those services become more securely funded and more recognized as a piece of the pie, rather than as they are now often seen as kind of add-ons or luxuries.
Right. And I think just to finish that whole thing, one of the outgrowths of this development in different parts of the world has also been the recognition that there can be a focus on competitive work, regular schooling with support, regular housing with support, and that's become a practice rather than just some sort of vague idea. Go ahead.
I'm Yu Kim Wang from Singapore. First of all, thank you for letting me be here. I have a question around the survey that you did. Are these mainly from westernized countries who have received training maybe of the model that is being developed here in America, or is it that they are from non-westernized countries, but the idea have arisen even with people who have not, like myself, kind of received psych rehab training based on what is happening here in America?
The survey was not here in the United States. This was just one of the 7 continents, but we tried to get key informants in each of the continents and contacted programs through those 41 key informants. So the Asian countries were involved, as well as Africa, North America, South America, Europe. And remember that I said it's to various degrees. It wasn't all the same way in these various regions. So that was the first part of your question. The second part, whether it was people who were trained in rehabilitation or not, because of the way that we went about it, it was people who were mostly not trained in rehabilitation. There were a few, but it was just people within who were known to mental health services, basically.
And I'd like to add to that,
Yes.
that the consumer survivor movement, which for many years was concentrated in the rich countries of the world, in North America, Europe, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, is now growing enormously in many parts of the world. We had a conference of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry a few years ago in Denmark. The previous conference we had, I think, about 20 or so countries, and at this conference, which was a few years ago in Denmark, we had 50 countries, 10 of them from Africa. The next conference, which is being planned for 2007 or 2008, will be held in Africa. So this movement is now growing worldwide and is spreading throughout all of the world, and is not just the province of the rich countries. And in fact, the people in many of the less developed parts of the world who have psychiatric labels are trying to overcome difficulties that some of us in the richer countries can't even imagine, and they're doing just incredible work. Organizing around the principles of self-help and mutual support, and bringing about action for change, and having very strong impacts on those countries.
Right. Alan.
Alan Rosen again from Sydney. I just to follow on, Judy, from what you're saying, in terms of developing countries, also you were talking about First Peoples, and I think we in Australia and New Zealand have learnt from our Indigenous populations that the colonisation experience can become a double whammy if you've got mental illness as well. And I think we have learnt back from them in the wider population that, and you're talking about a power differential, that just having a mental illness and being under the thumb of professionals and of mental health laws and structures is a colonisation experience. And I guess we could conceive of a condition we could put into the new form of DSM called vocational ownership, which is a disorder that professionals have, which means we know what's best for you.
Absolutely. And the idea of the concept of colonization, some of us in the consumer survivor movement have thought of ourselves as having been colonized. Pat Deegan has done a lot of work in that area. But certainly for people who are ethnic or racial minorities within their own countries are facing a double whammy, and we're certainly trying to recognize that within the consumer survivor movement by encouraging people of color to develop their own analysis of how they're affected by the complex interactions of race, ethnicity, the label of mental illness, poverty, and so forth. And their experiences are different from that of the majority culture, and we really need to listen to that and learn from that.
Right. And I think because we're getting signals that we're coming to the end, and we are talking to graduate programs that are training professionals, I think it's important for us, and the reason Judy and I wanted to do this webcast together is to state that there is space for professionals to be helpful if they learn how to be helpful. It is not that what we're saying is, that there is no hope.
There needs to be growing opportunities
Right.
for dialogue, for learning from each other, for recognizing the value of experiential knowledge
Yes.
within a framework that has been primarily academic, and recognizing that the value of academic knowledge is great and real, but the value of experiential knowledge is also great and real. And if we don't, if we allow those two things to come together, we're going to have something bigger and
Absolutely.
more successful, and see things from a variety of perspectives instead of just one.
So thank you very much for your attention today, and we hope you found this webcast to be interesting and informative.